A woman stands on an auction block, her face hidden beneath a tattered shawl. The crowd laughs. They call her the gargoyle. Damaged goods that nobody wants. Not a single hand rises to bid. Then the saloon doors crash open. A mountain man emerges from the shadows, a giant who hunts with wolves and kills with his bare hands. He throws a bag of gold onto the bar and growls 3 words, "I'll take her." But here's what nobody in that room knows. Beneath those scars hides a Boston heiress worth millions. And the men hunting her? They're not coming to bring her home. They're coming to put her in the ground. What happens next will shatter everything you think you know about beauty, worth, and what one man will sacrifice for love. The lesson: your scars don't define your value. They reveal your strength. The people who truly see you will never look away. If this story moved you, drop a comment below telling me, would you have forgiven Uncle Cornelius? Hit like if you believe broken people deserve love too. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe so you never miss another story that might just change how you see the world. The auctioneer's wooden mallet cracked against the bar, the sound sharp as a rifle shot cutting through the thick saloon smoke. Sunbeams sliced through the gloom, lighting up dust motes dancing around the woman on the auction block. She kept her chin tucked down, a ragged shawl pulled tight to hide the ugly, puckered burns that ruined the left side of her face. The townsfolk snickered, their cruel laughter bubbling up over their whiskey. They had a name for her, the Gargoyle of Oak Haven. Not a single hand went up to bid. The quiet stretched out, heavy and humiliating, until the steady beat of spurred boots on the floorboards made everyone shut their mouths. A man as big as a bear lumbered out of the shadows. It was Silas Kincaid, the hermit from the high mountains, a fella they said hunted with wolves and could kill a man with his bare hands. He paid the crowd no mind. He just tossed a heavy sack of gold dust onto the bar. "I will take her," he growled. Nobody in that room had a clue, but right then and there, the future of the whole Colorado Territory had just taken a sharp turn. This was October 14th, 1874. Out in the Colorado Territory, a man could get himself killed over a good horse, and a woman on her own was worth less than the mud on your boots. Down in the mining town of Oak Haven, folks had traded their morals for silver a long time ago. This bride auction, it was not exactly legal. The law did not allow for selling women, but Mayor Holloway, he called it a sponsorship for poor orphans. Truth was, it was a marketplace for cheap labor and lonely men. Sarah Jenkins stood on that crate, her hands shaking inside the worn-out wool of her dress. At 24, she was already an old maid on the frontier, and with her face she was considered damaged goods by any measure. The fire that killed her parents 3 years back in St. Louis had left her with nothing but a name she despised and a face that sent children running. The scarred skin pulled tight from her temple clean down to her jaw, tugging her eye into a permanent look of sadness. "All right now, gentlemen," the auctioneer, a greasy fella named Tobias Finch, yelled out. "She has strong teeth and can scrub a floor clean. Do I hear $5, too?" A wave of laughter washed over the room. A drunk miner sitting up front spat, a stream of tobacco juice that landed near the hem of Sarah's dress. "I would not give a nickel for a face that could curdle fresh milk." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, just let me die," she prayed inside her head. "Let the floorboards just split open and swallow me." She had run from the whispers back east, only to find the insults out west were a whole lot louder. That is when the saloon doors swung open with a long groan. The air inside the place suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. Silas Kincaid was a living legend in Oak Haven, but not the kind of story you tell your kids at night. He was a mountain man who lived way up above the timberline, near the jagged peaks of the San Juans. He only came to town twice a year for supplies. He stood a good 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to haul a tree. His beard was a wild mess of black and gray, and his eyes were the color of cold, hard steel. The crowd just melted away from him. Even that drunk miner tucked his feet in. Silas stomped right up to the bar, bringing the smell of pine trees, old leather, and gunpowder with him. He looked at Tobias Finch, then his eyes landed on Sarah. He did not look at her with pity. He did not look at her with want. He looked at her like a man sizing up a tool he might have a use for. He was weighing her worth. "I need a woman to keep my cabin," Silas said, his voice a low rumble you could feel in your bones. "Winter is coming on fast. I need someone to cook and work the hides while I'm out trapping." "She is yours for $10, Concade," Tobias said with a shaky laugh. "But I'm telling you, she spooks mighty easy." Silas did not bother to argue the price. He dropped a heavy leather pouch on the bar. It landed with a solid thud that said it held a whole lot more than $10 in gold dust. "Pack your things," he told Sarah. Sarah looked up, her good eye wide with fear. This man looked more like a grizzly bear than a person. He was frightening, but he was also her only way off that crate. "I have nothing to pack, sir," she whispered. Silas just grunted. He shrugged off his heavy buffalo hide coat and tossed it to her. It smelled of wood smoke and fresh rain. "Put this on, it gets awful cold up on the ridge." As the two of them walked out, the whole saloon went quiet. All you could hear was the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Sarah kept her head bowed low, but she could feel every eye in that room burning a hole in her back. She was just leaving one kind of hell to walk straight into a monster's den, or at least that is what she figured. What the town did not see was how Silas put his big frame between her and the crowd on their way out, his hand resting near the big Colt Peacemaker on his hip. He was not dragging her along, he was walking her out. But the real show started when they got to his wagon. There was a man watching them from an alley. A man wearing a suit that was way too fancy for a mining town, with a Pinkerton Detective Agency badge tucked away inside his coat. He took out a small notebook and wrote, "Subject located, heading north. The target is with him." The trip up to Concade's cabin took 3 long days. It was a hard climb up into the clouds where the air got thin, and the trees looked like the twisted old bones of ancient pines. For the first 2 days, Silas hardly said 10 words. He was a man who did not waste anything. He guided the mules with little clicks of his tongue and handled the dangerous mountain roads with an instinct that seemed almost unnatural. Sarah sat beside him on the wagon seat, bundled up in the huge buffalo coat. She watched him out of the corner of her eye. He was a rough-looking man. His hands were scarred and calloused, and his face was tanned by the wind and sun. He looked like he was a part of the mountain itself, tough and unforgiving. On the second night, they camped out by a fast-moving creek. The cold had a real bite to it, a stark reminder that winter in the Rocky Mountains was a death sentence if you were not ready. Silas built a fire like he had done it 1,000 times. He roasted a rabbit he had caught earlier and gave Sarah the leg with the most meat on it. "Eat," was all he said. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet from not being used. She pulled her shawl tighter around her, a habit she had to cover the left side of her face. Silas sat on a log across from her, sharpening his skinning knife. The steady scrape of steel on stone was almost calming. Then all of a sudden he stopped. "You do not have to hide it from me," he said. He did not even look up from his knife. Sarah went still. "Hide what?" "Your face. I have seen worse. I saw a man get torn up by a mountain lion once. Half his head was gone. He lived. A burn is just a sign of surviving." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "It bothers people." "It bothers weak people," Silas grumbled. He finally looked up, his steel-colored eyes cutting right through her defenses. "How did it happen?" Sarah paused. The lie she had been telling for 3 years was right there on her lips. A lantern tipped over in the barn, but something about the wide-open mountains, or maybe the raw honesty of the man sitting across from her, made that lie get stuck in her throat. "It was not an accident," she said, her voice shaking. "It was a lesson. Silas stopped his sharpening. He just looked at her. He really looked at her for a long time. He did not ask who taught her the lesson. He did not ask for any of the ugly details. He just gave a small nod, put his knife away, and poked at the fire. "A fire clears out all the dead stuff on the forest floor," Silas said softly. "It makes room for new things to grow, but it hurts like hell while it is burning." That night, Sarah did not sleep well. She dreamed she was back in the mansion in Boston, not St. Louis. She dreamed of the thick velvet curtains and the smell of expensive cigars. She dreamed of her uncle, Cornelius Whitney, and the glass of acid he held in his hand. His face was twisted into a mean sneer. "If you will not marry the senator, Isabella, then I will make sure no man ever wants to look at you again." She woke up with a scream. Before she even knew what was happening, a heavy hand was on her shoulder. She started to fight, completely terrified, but the hand held her steady. "Easy." Silas's voice was a low rumble in the darkness. "You are safe. It is just the wind." She was breathing hard, and tears were rolling down her scarred cheek. She expected him to yell at her, to tell her to be quiet. Instead, he just handed her a tin cup full of water. He sat by the fire for the rest of the night with his back to her, like a silent guardian standing watch against her bad memories. The next afternoon, their wagon finally broke through the trees. The cabin was tucked into a little valley just below a giant granite mountain. It was built from huge logs, low and strong to survive the winter snows. As they pulled up, Silas hopped down and then helped her get down. His hands were huge, easily circling her tiny waist, but he lifted her down as gentle as could be. "Home," he said. Sarah looked around at the wild, beautiful land. It was so far from everything. If he wanted to hurt her out here, nobody would ever find out. "Why me?" she asked, the question just tumbling out of her mouth. "Why did you buy me, Mr. Kincaid? There were younger women, prettier women." Silas started unhitching the mules. He stopped and patted the lead mule on its side. "I did not want a pretty woman," Silas said, his eyes looking out over the valley where an eagle was circling. "Pretty women want to live in the city. They want silk dresses and parties. I wanted someone who knows what it is like to be broken. Because this mountain," he said, waving his hand toward the sharp peaks, "it breaks everyone sooner or later. Only the ones who have already been broken know how to put themselves back together." He studied her for a moment, and for the very first time the edge of his mouth pulled into something like a smile. "And you, Sarah Jenkins, or whatever name you truly go by, you have the eyes of a she-wolf that got caught in a snare and gnawed her own leg off to get free. That is the kind of partner I am looking for." A chill went straight through Sarah. Whatever your real name is, he knew. Or he had a strong suspicion, at least. She clutched her shawl even tighter around her. This mountain man was not just a powerful brute. He noticed things, and that quality made him a dangerous man. But when she walked into the cabin and saw the rough-hewn table and the ashes in the hearth, she understood something new. He had not demanded to know her real name. He had given her the room to hold on to her secret for the time being. November carried in the first snows, and with them came a quiet so heavy it felt like a weight on your soul. The cabin, buried halfway up the rocky mountainside, became a small spot of warmth in a vast and violent sea of white. For the first 2 weeks, Sarah, or Isabella, as she would whisper to herself in the dead of night, moved about the cabin like a spook. She was deathly afraid of making any kind of mistake. Back in her uncle's fine house in Boston, a mistake earned her a sharp rap of a cane across her knuckles. Here, she was certain it would mean being thrown out into the bitter, freezing emptiness. Silas was a man who lived by a steady rhythm. He rose before the sun, built up the fire, drank coffee as black as pitch, and vanished into the timberline to go check on his traps. He came back when the sun went down, carrying the smell of cold air and animal musk, and usually had a pair of rabbits or a beaver pelt to show for it. He never laid a hand on her. He hardly said 2 words to her. But his eyes were always on her. One night, Sarah tried her hand at making a stew. She had never cooked a single meal in her entire life before the fire. That was a job for the servants. In the lean years after she ran away, she had gotten by on whatever scraps she could find. Now, looking at a skinned rabbit and a bag of potatoes, she was completely lost. She boiled the meat until it was tough as leather, and the potatoes turned into a watery paste. Her hands trembled when she placed the bowl down in front of Silas. Silas lifted a spoonful to his mouth. He chewed for a long time, the muscles in his jaw working on the chewy meat. The silence in the room stretched out for what felt like an hour. Sarah prepared herself for him to throw the bowl against the wall. Instead, Silas swallowed his bite. "Need some salt," he said with a grunt. He grabbed the tin and shook some into his bowl. "And next time, throw the wild onions in toward the end. They get bitter if you boil them for too long." He kept on eating. He finished every last bit. Sarah could only stare at him in disbelief. "You are not angry?" Silas glanced up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Going hungry is a sin, Sarah. Bad cooking is just a simple mistake. You will get the hang of it." That evening, for the first time in a very long while, Sarah did not cry before she fell asleep. The real turning point arrived 3 weeks later. A blizzard had been screaming for 2 whole days, keeping them locked inside. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally settled down and Silas went outside to clear the heavy snow off the roof. Sarah was sweeping the hearth when she heard a terrible cracking sound, followed by a choked cry. She threw the heavy oak door wide open. Silas was down in the snow next to the woodpile. A giant icicle, as sharp as a spear and as heavy as a blacksmith's anvil, had snapped off from the edge of the roof. It hit his shoulder and knocked him backward, right onto the sharp blade of the axe he had been carrying. "Silas!" she screamed, but the wind stole the name right from her mouth. She did not hesitate. The frightened young woman from the auction stage was gone, and something else rose up in her place, a deep instinct from a past life she had worked so hard to bury. She ran straight to him. The snow all around him was already turning a frightening shade of red. The axe blade had cut deep into his thigh, striking an artery. Silas was moaning, his face had turned a pale gray, and he was grinding his teeth together in pain. He tried to get up, but his leg would not hold him. "Do not move," she ordered. Her voice was not a whisper any longer. It held the clear authority of her Whitney family heritage. She hooked her arms under his and pulled. He was a heavy man, like dragging a stone, but a surge of adrenaline gave her a strength she never knew she had. She pulled him through the deep snow, 1 painful inch at a time, until they both fell through the cabin door. She kicked the door closed with her foot and dragged him onto the bearskin rug near the fireplace. "Whiskey," she said sharply, "and your sewing kit right now." Silas, who was lightheaded from losing so much blood, pointed a weak finger toward a shelf. Sarah moved with a frightening kind of purpose. She poured whiskey directly into the deep, open wound. Silas let out a roar, his whole body arching up from the floor. "Hold still," she hissed at him. "The femoral artery is not cut, but the vastus medialis is sliced open. If I do not close this wound, you will bleed to death in 10 minutes." Silas, looking through a fog of pure agony, stared at her. Vastus medialis. Those were the words a doctor would use. Latin words, not something a scarred orphan girl from the city gutters would know. Sarah threaded the needle. She did not have proper surgical thread, just the thick kind used for patching up canvas trousers. It would have to work. "This is going to hurt," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "Drink." She pushed the bottle to his lips. He took 3 long swallows of the whiskey. Then she started to sew. Her hands, which were usually so shy and unsteady, were now as firm as stone. She pinched the edges of the skin together, pushing the needle through the tough muscle. Silas groaned, and his hand tightened around the table leg until the wood groaned with him. But he did not try to pull away. He just watched her. He watched how she cleaned the wound and how she tied the stitches with a special complicated knot that surgeons use, not seamstresses. The whole thing took 20 minutes. When she finished, she wrapped his leg tightly with clean strips of cloth she had torn from her own petticoats. She sat back on her heels, covered in his blood. Her hair had come loose from its bun, and the firelight flickered across her scarred face. She was breathing hard. Silas lay there, his own chest rising and falling. The bleeding had finally stopped. "Who in the world are you?" he rasped, his voice all rough from the pain and the shock. "That was not just some simple woman's task. You stitched me up like a battlefield surgeon." Sarah froze right where she was. The adrenaline suddenly left her, and she began to shake. She looked down at her own bloody hands. "My uncle," she whispered, the truth spilling out before she could catch it. "He was a man of medicine. He allowed me to read his books. He let me watch when the doctors would visit." Silas's eyes narrowed as he put the pieces together. "Rich men have doctors come to their homes," he said. "Poor folks have to go to the barber or the man who uses leeches." Sarah turned her head to the side, trying to hide her scar from his view. "I was not always poor, Silas, and I was not always scarred." Silas reached out his hand, huge and calloused, and gently wrapped it around her small, blood-covered wrist. He did not pull her closer. He just held on, like an anchor in a storm. "There is nothing ugly about you, Sarah," he said very gently. "And what you did today, that was the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed." The feeling inside the small cabin changed. The whole idea of a master and a servant, a rescuer and a victim, it all just melted away. They were just two people, high up on a mountain, bound together by blood and snow. December 20th, 1874. Silas healed up with the kind of quickness you see in a wild animal, but he would walk with a limp for the rest of that winter. While he was recovering, the cabin began to change. It stopped being just a shelter from the storms and started to feel like a real home. Sarah Isabella took charge of all the daily chores. She learned how to chop firewood, and her swing got better and better until she could split a small log with one clean strike. She learned to tell the difference between the tracks of a rabbit and the dangerous paw prints of a mountain lion. But the most important change was that she started to read to him. Silas owned a handful of books, all of them old and water-damaged, that he kept in a wooden trunk. He had Shakespeare, the Holy Bible, and a copy of the Odyssey. In the long, dark evenings, while the wind howled outside like a restless spirit, Sarah would read the stories out loud. Her voice, which had been quiet and scratchy, became clear and pleasant to hear. She began to speak with the rhythm of her old education, and her accent changed from the flat sound of a street beggar back to the proper, educated speech of Boston's high society. Silas would sit by the fire and whittle wood while he listened. He came to understand that he was sharing his home with the ghost of an upper-class lady. He put all the clues together in his mind: the Latin words, the fancy accent, the way she kept her back so straight when she did not think anyone was watching. She was on the run from something much, much worse than being poor. But far below them in the valley, the snow was beginning to melt, and a different kind of poison was starting to thaw. Down in the town of Oakhaven, a man named Arthur Hayes sat by himself in the saloon, sipping on a glass of expensive brandy. He was a man who looked like he did not belong in the West, but his eyes had a coldness in them that fit in just fine. He pulled a photograph from his coat pocket. It was an old-fashioned tintype. The picture showed a breathtakingly beautiful young woman with perfect skin, standing beside a serious-looking older man with long sideburns. Cornelius Whitney. "You said a man bought a woman with a scarred face back in October," Hayes said to the man behind the bar. The bartender, who was busy wiping a glass, gave a nod. "Yep. Silas Kincaid took that gargoyle off our hands. It was the best thing that ever happened to this town. Kincaid. Hayes repeated the name to himself. Where does he live? Up on the high peaks, a place called Eagle's Nest Ridge. But you cannot get up there right now. The pass is snowed in until the spring. Hayes smiled. It was a cold smile, like a snake's. I do not need to wait for spring. I have money, and money can melt snow a lot faster than the sun. Hayes was not simply a detective. He was a problem solver for the very wealthy Whitney family. Cornelius Whitney had taken control of his niece's inheritance, a shipping fortune that was worth millions of dollars, after her parents passed away. But there was a catch written into the will. If Isabella got married before she turned 25 years old, the entire fortune would go back to her. Cornelius had tried to make her marry a crooked senator so he could keep control of the money. When she said no, he set up the accident with the acid to destroy her chances of ever finding a husband. But he never imagined that she would run away. And as long as she was still alive, the fortune was at risk. She had to be permanently removed. Hayes hired 3 men that very night. One of them was the drunken miner who had spat at Sarah during the sale. The other 2 were the McCann brothers, a pair of known cattle thieves who would just as soon kill a man as look at him. We head out at dawn, Hayes commanded. $500 apiece when it is over. Up on the mountain, the solstice came. Silas's leg felt a whole lot stronger. He figured he would check the lower ridge for any elk. The food supply was running low. You stay put inside, he warned Sarah. The wolves get mighty hungry this time of year. Come back in one piece, she told him. Her eyes stayed locked on his. Without even thinking about it, she reached up and fixed his collar. Silas went stock still. Such a simple touch felt like a lightning strike. He looked down at her, his eyes trying to read her face. He gently traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing over the rough ridge of her scar. I always... Come back, he vowed. He guided the mule down the winding trails, the air sharp enough to bite. He rode for 3 miles down to where the trees began. He found the tracks of an elk, but he also found something else. Pulling his mule to a halt, Silas swung himself to the ground. He knelt down by a section of disturbed snow. Fresh horse droppings. He broke a piece apart in his gloved hand. It was still warm to the touch. Silas looked hard at the tree line. He spotted a broken spruce branch, snapped by a rider who passed too close. He saw the clear mark of a horseshoe, a flat one, the kind city horses wore, not the cleated shoes for mountain animals. 4 riders, and they were headed up. A cold fear settled deep in his gut, and it had nothing to do with the winter chill. They were coming for her. He forgot all about the elk. He spun the mule around and dug his heels into its sides. The animal grunted in protest but charged up the frozen path. He burst through the cabin door an hour later, fighting for breath. Sarah looked up from her sewing, her face full of alarm. Silas, what is it? He did not say a word. He walked right over to the gun rack. He took down the Winchester repeating rifle and a box of shells. Next, he grabbed his heavy Colt revolver and tucked it firmly into his belt. Get a bag packed, he ordered her. Put in food, blankets, and ammunition. Do it now. Why? What is going on? Sarah got to her feet, the mending cloth tumbling from her lap. Silas faced her. His expression was set for a fight. There are men coming. 4 of them, armed to the teeth. He stepped toward her and put his hands on her shoulders. They are not from around here, Sarah. They are on city horses. Sarah's face turned white as a sheet, making the scar on her face stand out like a purple bolt of lightning. It is him, she whispered. He has found me. Who? Silas gave her a little shake. I have to know who we are up against, Sarah. No more secrets. Who is coming up my mountain? Sarah looked deep into his eyes and saw no judgment there, just a blazing, protective fire. My uncle sent them, she said, her voice shaking but steady. My real name is Isabella Whitney. I am the heir to the Whitney Shipping Company in Boston. And the man who is on his way, he is not here to bring me back, Silas. He is here to put me in the ground. Silas just stared at her. All the different pieces finally fell into place. Her good education, her constant fear, the awful burns. It was never just cruelty. It was greed, a cold and calculating greed. He let go of her shoulders and worked the lever on the Winchester. Clack, clack. "Well, Miss Whitney," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, "they might have the law in their pocket back in Boston, but up here the only law is gravity. And they have got a long, long way to fall." He shoved the table over, making a barrier in front of the door. "Do you know how to shoot?" he asked. Sarah looked at the heavy revolver he was holding out to her. She remembered her father, who taught her to shoot clay pigeons on the lawn of their summer home, before the fire burned everything away. She took the firearm. It felt heavy, cold, and smelled of gun oil. "I do not miss," she stated plainly. Silas grinned, a fierce baring of teeth. "Good, because we have got company." A gunshot ripped through the quiet valley and the window pane over the sink exploded. Glass rained down all over the floor. The siege of Eagle's Nest had started. The peaceful silence of the mountains was shattered by the sound of pure violence. Bullets tore through the pine logs of the cabin, sending splinters flying like little wooden knives. The air inside grew thick with dust and the sharp smell of gunpowder. Silas moved like a mountain lion. He did not run. He slid from one spot to the next. He kicked the heavy oak table completely over, making a V-shaped shield near the window. "Keep your head down," he yelled over the noise. Sarah was crouched behind that table, her hands clutching the heavy Colt revolver so hard her knuckles looked like white bone. She was not screaming. The first wave of shock was gone, replaced by a cold and focused calm. This felt familiar. The chaos, the awful noise. It was exactly like the night of that fire in St. Louis. Except this time she was not a little girl stuck in her room. This time she had a gun. Outside, Arthur Hayes's voice sliced through the gunfire, sounding calm and terribly polite. "Mr. Kincaid, there is no call for this kind of foolishness. Just send the girl out. She took something that does not belong to her. Give her up, and we will be on our way. You can keep your gold, your furs, and your life." Silas spat right on the floorboards. He peeked through a small gap between the logs. He caught a glimpse of movement over by the woodpile, a bit of a brown coat. Crack! Silas fired the Winchester. A scream came from the woodpile, followed by a string of curses. "I do not trade people, Hayes," Silas hollered back, his voice echoing. "And I do not talk business with cowards who hide behind trees. Step on out here and say it like a man." "Have it your own way," Hayes called back. The shooting got even heavier. The attackers were pinning them down, trying to keep their heads low. "They are trying to flank us," Silas hissed. He glanced over at Sarah. "They are working their way to the back door. The woodshed leads right to the pantry. If they get inside there, they have got us trapped." He looked from the big iron stove over to Sarah. He grabbed a box of cartridges and slid it across the floor toward her. "I need you to watch the front," Silas said, his eyes locking with hers. "If you see anything move past that tree line, you shoot. Do not bother aiming, just point the gun and pull the trigger. Make 'em think we are a whole army in here." "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, a sudden fear rising in her chest. "I am going to go say howdy to our guests at the back door." Silas grabbed his hunting knife and another pistol off the mantelpiece, a mean-looking sawed-off shotgun he kept for snakes. He stayed low to the ground and vanished into the dark shadows of the pantry. Sarah was now by herself in the main room. The front window was just a jagged mess of broken glass. She saw a shape pull away from the pine trees. It was that drunken miner, made bold by whiskey and the promise of a payday. He was running for the porch with a lit torch in his hand. Fire. They were fixing to burn them out alive. Sarah lifted the heavy Colt. Her hand was shaking. The man was about 30 yards away. "Do not aim, just point." She pulled the hammer back. The click sounded as loud as a cannon in her ears. She squeezed the trigger. The gun jumped hard, and the recoil bruised her wrist. The bullet went wide of the miner, kicking up a shower of snow about 3 feet to his left. But it was enough. The miner dove headfirst into the snow, dropping the flaming torch. "She is shooting!" the miner screamed, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. "The woman is shooting back!" Meanwhile, at the back of the cabin, the heavy bar on the woodshed door slowly started to rise. The tip of a knife slipped through the crack, working to lift the latch. Silas was standing in the darkness of the pantry, his breathing even and slow. He waited. The door creaked as it opened. A blast of cold air rushed in. One of the McCann brothers stepped through. He had a sick grin on his face and a big Bowie knife in his hand. He took a step inside, his eyes getting used to the dark. He never even saw Silas. Silas moved out from the side, grabbing McCann by his collar and smashing him face first into the pantry shelves. Jars of canned peaches exploded, covering the floor with sticky syrup and broken glass. McCann grunted and swung his knife wildly. The blade cut Silas on the forearm, slicing through his heavy wool shirt and drawing blood. Silas did not even flinch. He drove his knee hard into McCann's gut, which bent him in half, then brought the stock of the shotgun down hard on the back of the man's head. McCann dropped like a sack of rocks, but the second brother was right on his heels. He aimed a revolver straight at Silas. Bang! The shot flew wild, lodging itself in the ceiling as Silas slammed the door shut on the man's arm. The brother howled in pain as the heavy oak door crunched his bones. Silas fired the shotgun right through the wood of the door. The screaming stopped. Silas stood in the pantry, breathing hard. Blood was dripping from his arm. The smell of peaches and burnt gunpowder was thick in the air. 2 down. But then he smelled something else. Smoke. And not from a gun. Wood smoke. "Silas!" Sarah's voice shrieked from the other room. "The roof! They threw the torch onto the roof!" Silas sprinted back into the main room. An orange glow was already starting to flicker through the cracks in the ceiling boards. The dry pine needles and moss they had used for insulation were catching like kindling. The cabin was not just on fire. It was about to become an oven. "We have got to get out of here," Silas yelled. He snatched his heavy buffalo coat and threw it over Sarah, smothering a spark that had landed on her dress. "Go where?" Sarah coughed, the smoke getting thicker by the second. "They will be waiting for us outside." "The mine shaft," Silas said. "It is 50 yards east, behind that big boulder. It comes out down by the lower creek bed. It is the only way." He grabbed a heavy sack of ammunition and the Winchester. "I will give them something to shoot at," Silas said, gripping her shoulders tightly. "You run for that boulder. Do not you look back, and do not stop for anything. If I go down, you keep running. Do you understand me, Isabella?" He used her real name. It was his way of saying he saw her for who she was, not just his cook, but a woman worth saving, a woman with a life to live. "I will not leave you," she cried, tears cutting paths through the soot on her face. "You are not leaving me," Silas lied. "You are just scouting the trail ahead. Now go." Silas kicked the front door wide open and let out a roar that shook the snow right off the trees. He stepped out on the porch, and that Winchester of his just started roaring. He fired fast into the tree line where Hayes and the last of his men were hiding. Sarah yelled, "Run!" She took a dive right off the side of the porch. She landed in deep snow, her skirts getting all tangled up in her legs. She clawed her way over to a huge granite rock that sat by the mine entrance. Behind her, the cabin lit up the night sky like a torch. Bullets were zipping right past her, buzzing like a swarm of mad hornets. She could hear Silas shouting and the deep boom of his rifle answering the sharp cracks of the other men's pistols. When she got to the rock, she dared to look back. Silas was not running. He was stuck behind the water trough, pinned down with heavy fire coming from 2 sides. Hayes had figured he might do that. He had men hidden in the trees on the east side, too. Silas was trapped proper. The heat coming off that burning cabin was so fierce it was melting the snow on the porch. It was turning into a slick sludge of mud and ash. Silas slapped a new magazine into his Winchester. His hands were slippery with blood from a cut on his arm. He risked a look toward the big rock. He saw Sarah's pale face peeking around it. She had not gone down into the mine. She was waiting on him. He let out a low growl, thinking about that stubborn woman. But a powerful sense of pride swelled up in his chest. He knew he had to move. If he stayed put, he would either burn up or get shot. If he made a run for it, he was a wide-open target. He saw Hayes step out from the tree line, walking like he owned the world, a long-barreled Schofield revolver in his hand. Hayes was smiling. The firelight danced in the man's eyes, making him look like the devil himself, dressed up in a fancy suit. "It's all over, Cade," Hayes shouted over the roar. "That roof is fixin' to come down. Just give it up." Silas pushed himself to his feet. He did not raise his hands. He raised his rifle. But before he could even squeeze the trigger, a shot cracked from off to the side. It was a sniper Hayes had put on the ridge high above. The bullet slammed into Silas's right shoulder, spinning him completely around. The rifle just flew from his fingers, which had gone numb. He stumbled and fell hard against the burning logs of his own cabin wall. The pain was just blinding, like a white-hot poker had been shoved clear through his joint. "No," Sarah screamed. She left the safety of the rock. She ran right back toward the fire, right toward him. "Sarah, don't," Silas groaned as he slid down the wall. He reached for the Colt, tucked in his belt with his left hand, but his vision was all swimming. Sarah got to him and grabbed his good arm, trying to pull him up. "Get up, Silas, please, you have to get up." "Run," he managed to rasp out. "Well, isn't this touching?" Hayes's voice was just dripping with sarcasm. He was standing about 10 feet away. He had his gun leveled right at Silas's head. Two other men stepped out of the smoke, surrounding them. Sarah spun around, using her own body to shield Silas. She lifted the heavy revolver she was still holding, aiming it straight at Hayes's chest. "You back off," she screamed. "I will kill you." Hayes did not even flinch. He just made a clucking sound. "Isabella. Isabella. Now you put that gun down. You know you don't have the stomach to kill a man in cold blood. Accidents in a barn are one thing. This is something else entirely." He took a step closer. "And look at your beast of a man. He is done for. Even if I let you two walk away, he will bleed out in an hour or just freeze to death. Your cabin is gone." He cleared his throat. "All your supplies are gone." Hayes looked down at Silas, who was fighting just to stay awake. "You put up a good fight, mountain man, but you are punching way above your weight. This just ties up a loose end." Hayes cocked the hammer. "No!" Sarah lunged forward. She was not fast enough to shoot Hayes, but she was fast enough to knock his aim off. The gun fired. The bullet missed Silas's head. It caught him in the side, just a little above his hip. The force of it lifted him up, throwing him backward right over the edge of the porch railing. Below that porch was a steep, icy ravine that went all the way down to a frozen river. Sarah could only watch in horror as Silas went tumbling backward. He hit the snow and his body rolled, limp as a rag doll. He crashed through the brush, going down, down, down into the dark of the canyon. A splash echoed all the way up, and then there was just silence. "Silas!" Her scream tore her throat raw. She tried to jump right after him, but rough hands grabbed her. The last McClellan brother held her arms, pinning them tight behind her back. "He is dead, darling," Hayes said. He holstered his pistol and brushed some ash off his lapel. "That river runs under the ice down there. No man survives a fall like that, especially not with 2 bullets in him." Sarah fought. She kicked and she bit. She even spat right in Hayes's face. Hayes calmly wiped the spit away and then backhanded her hard. The blow sent her stumbling, her vision going black for just a second. "That is quite enough," Hayes said in a cold voice. "Tie her hands. Gag her. We have a long ride to Denver to catch that train heading east." He leaned in real close to her ear, while his men tied her wrists with a brutal toughness. "Your uncle is very eager to see you, Isabella. He already has the wedding papers all drawn up. And do not you worry about your face. A heavy veil can cover a whole mess of sins. They dragged her away from the burning wreck of the cabin. Sarah looked back just one last time at that dark ravine. The falling snow was already covering the tracks. The fire roared, eating up the only home she had ever known where she felt safe. "He is not dead," she told herself. She said it over and over to fight off the despair. "He is the mountain. You cannot kill the mountain." Down in the abyss, at the very bottom of the ravine, the world was cold and wet. Silas had not fallen into the main current of the river. He had crashed right through a shelf of ice and landed on a sandbar. He was half sunk in freezing slush. The pain was just total. It felt like a living thing that was chewing on his mind. His shoulder felt shattered. His side was on fire. The freezing water was already pulling all the heat from his body. He tried to move, but darkness swarmed in at the edges of his sight. He just lay there, staring up at the faraway orange glow of his burning home high above. He closed his eyes. It would be so easy to just let go, to just fall asleep. The pain would finally stop. The cold would start to feel warm, like it always does right before the end. You have the eyes of a wolf that's been caught in a trap. A wolf that chewed its own leg off to get free. His own words came back to him in his mind. He heard a sound. It was not the wind, and it was not the water. It was footsteps, soft, padded footsteps in the snow. Silas forced his heavy eyelids to open. A pair of yellow eyes were reflecting the moonlight. Then he saw another pair, and then a third. It was the wolf pack, the timber wolves from the San Juans. He had hunted them, and they had hunted his mules. They knew the smell of blood. They could smell his weakness. The alpha male, a giant animal with a scarred ear, stepped onto the sandbar. He lowered his head and sniffed the air. He let out a low growl, a deep rumble that Silas felt in his own chest. Silas could not reach his knife. It was long gone. He had nothing. "Come on, then," Silas wheezed, with blood bubbling on his lips. "Finish it." The wolf stepped closer. It sniffed Silas's hand, the hand that smelled of gunpowder and pine trees, but the wolf did not bite. It licked the blood from Silas's frozen fingers. Then it threw its head back and howled. It was a long, sad sound that echoed all the way up the canyon walls, like a signal to all things wild. Silas did not die. The anger inside him just would not let him. The picture of Sarah's terrified face being dragged away by a man in a silk suit was like a hot coal burning in his gut. It was hotter than that freezing river. He dug his fingers into the frozen mud. He dragged himself 1 inch, and then another. He was not a man anymore. He was something else entirely. He was the reckoning that was coming, the long crawl. The river did not kill Silas Connecade, though it surely tried its best. He washed up on the shore 2 miles, downstream, just a broken pile of bone and frozen meat. For 3 days, he drifted in and out, lost in a feverish dream inside a little cave made of tree roots. He stayed alive by eating snow and the raw meat of a squirrel he managed to kill with a rock, his left hand shaking something fierce. It was an old Ute trapper by the name of Red Elk who found him. Red Elk had seen the smoke from the burning cabin from miles away. He did not ask any questions. He stitched up Silas's side with sinew. He set the shattered shoulder with a rough skill that made Silas pass out clean from the pain. "You ought to be dead, mountain walker," Red Elk said, while feeding him a broth made from bone marrow. "The spirits must have pushed you back." "Not the spirits," Silas rasped, his eyes burning with a feverish light. "A woman." It took 2 whole months before Silas could stand up without falling over. It took another month before he could even walk. By the time the snow finally melted in the Rockies, showing the blackened bones of his cabin, Silas was a changed man. He was thinner, and his face was bony and drawn. His beard now had streaks of white in it. He walked with a limp that would never go away, a hitch in his step that made him need a heavy hickory cane. But the weakness in his body only made his mind harder than stone. He dug up his hidden stash of gold, the savings from 20 years of trapping. He had buried it beneath the floorboards of the woodshed, which was the only part of his place that had not burned all the way down. He did not buy a mule. He bought a ticket on the Union Pacific Railroad. The Golden Cage, May, 1875. Boston, Massachusetts. The world of Isabella Whitney was a nightmare made of silk and the choking smell of perfume. She was nothing more than a prisoner inside her own home. Her uncle, Cornelius Whitney, had played the part of the grieving guardian just perfectly. He told everyone in high society that his poor niece had been found living in filth, taken by savages, her mind completely broken. He claimed he was saving her. The wedding to Senator Reginald Thorne was set for the 1st of June. It was supposed to be the biggest social event of the whole season. Thorne was a man of 50 with cold, damp hands, and a political debt that Isabella's family money would conveniently pay off. Isabella just sat at her vanity table staring at her own reflection. The maids had put heavy stage powder on the left side of her face, caking it on thick to hide the violet scars. It was no use. The rough map of her suffering was still plain to see under the powder. "Well, you look almost fit to be seen," Cornelius said, barging into her room without so much as a knock. "Senator Thorne is a forgiving man. He's willing to look past your condition for the sake of a family alliance." "I am with child," Isabella said. Her voice was as hollow as a dried gourd. Cornelius stopped in his tracks. His smile evaporated. "What in blazes did you just say?" Isabella turned to face him. "I am carrying a child. It is Silas Consincade's child. If I marry that senator, he'll be raising a mountain man's get." Cornelius's face swelled up, turning a deep shade of crimson. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and seized her chin, his fingers digging hard into her skin. "You will not tell a soul," he growled. "We'll send that baby off to an orphanage the minute it's born, or maybe it'll have the decency to be stillborn. Such things do happen." "He will come for me," Isabella whispered, her voice barely a breath. "He is not dead." Cornelius let out a laugh. It sounded like dry bones rattling. "My dear, Arthur Hayes is the finest killer money can hire. Your backwoods savage is rotting at the bottom of a canyon. You are all alone. You've always been all alone." The wedding of the century. Trinity Church was filled to the rafters. The Boston upper crust sat in their stiff pews, waving fans against the thick air. They were there to see the show, the return of the scarred eyes. Arthur Hayes stood near the back, propped up against a pillar, checking his pocket watch. He'd been paid a little something extra to make sure the whole affair went off without a hitch. He felt a strange prickle on his neck, that old instinct of a hunter who knows he's being watched. But when he looked back, there was nothing but the big oak doors. The organ music began to swell. The doors swung open. Isabella started down the aisle. She had on a veil of thick lace that hid her face completely. Her dress was made of imported satin, worth more than Silas's whole cabin and the land it sat on. She walked like a soul marching straight to the gallows. She finally reached the altar. Senator Thorne was waiting there, sweating and with a greedy look in his eye. Cornelius stood right beside her, his hand clamped on her elbow like a vice, a quiet warning. The priest started the service. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The words just washed right over Isabella. She shut her eyes behind the thick veil. "Silas," she thought, "I am so sorry." If any man can show just cause, why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. The silence that came next was just part of the ceremony, a simple formality. And then the heavy oak doors at the back of the church boomed open with a sound that was not the wind. A figure was framed there in the bright light of the street. He had on a dusty black coat that was pulled too tight across his shoulders. He wore boots that were scuffed up and worn clean through in spots. He leaned real heavy on a hickory walking stick. He looked like a wolf that had wandered into a pen full of prize sheep. Arthur Hayes pushed himself off the pillar. his hand already moving toward his coat pocket. "You," he breathed out, his eyes growing wide with pure disbelief. Silas Consincade paid the crowd no mind. He limped on forward, the thump drag of his cane echoing on the marble floor. "I object," Silas said. His voice was not the polite tone of some Boston gentleman. It was the low, gritty rumble of a rock slide. A wave of gasps went through the pews. Cornelius Whitney went white as a sheet. "Somebody get this riffraff out of here," he hollered. Hayes stepped into the aisle, putting himself right in Silas's path. "You are one tough man to put down, Cade. But this here is a respectable city. You cannot just come walking in here." Silas came to a halt. He looked Hayes right in the eye. The old scar on his own shoulder began to ache. "I did not come here to kill you, Hayes," Silas said in a low voice. "I came to testify." "Testify to what?" Silas looked right past Hayes, his gaze locking with the veiled woman standing at the altar. "That this lady is already a married woman." All hell broke loose right then and there. Senator Thorne glared at Cornelius. "What is the meaning of all this? The man is lying." Cornelius shrieked like a cornered animal. "He is a madman!" Silas reached inside his coat. Hayes flinched, pulling out his pistol. The ladies sitting in the front row let out a scream. But Silas did not pull out a gun. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was charred around the edges, stained with soot and old blood. It was the bill of sale from the Oak Haven Saloon. "October 14th, 1874, Silas read, his voice cutting clean through the commotion. "Paid in full with gold dust. By the laws of the territory and by the laws of the heart, she belongs to me. We jumped the broom up in the high pass. We shared a fire. She carries my name." He took one more heavy step. "And she carries my child." The church fell dead silent. Isabella tore the veil right off her head. She did not care about the scars, not anymore. She looked at the man she loved, all broken and limping, so out of place and yet so magnificent. "It is true," she cried out, her voice ringing loud and clear. "I am Isabella Consincade, and I will not marry this man." Cornelius, seeing his entire fortune just slipping through his fingers, plumb lost his mind. He grabbed Isabella by the arm. "You ungrateful, wicked thing, I will ruin you." "Let her go," Silas growled. Hayes lifted his pistol. "End of the line, mountain man." But Hayes had forgotten one important thing. This was not the wilderness. This was a room plumb full of witnesses, and that included a judge and the chief of police. And Silas Consincade was not just some backwoods brute anymore. He was a sensation. "Put the gun down, Arthur," a new voice called out from the side. It belonged to a Pinkerton captain that Silas had hired 3 days earlier with the very last of his gold. Police officers swarmed in from a side room. "Arthur Hayes, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Silas Consincade and for burning down the Eagle's Nest homestead," the captain shouted. Hayes looked all around him. He knew the game was up. He lowered his gun. Silas did not even wait for the police. He limped right past Hayes, past the stunned senator, and walked up the steps to the altar. Cornelius scrambled backward, trembling. "Stay back! She is a monster! Look at her face!" Silas stopped right in front of Isabella. He let his cane drop to the floor. He reached out with his own scarred, trembling hands and cupped her face, holding the burned side just as gently as the smooth one. "Well, now I am looking," Silas said, his voice loud enough for the folks in the back row to hear. "And I do not see a monster. I see the woman who saved my life. I see the mother of my child. I see the only beautiful thing in this whole blessed city." He kissed her. It was not some polite little society peck on the cheek. It was a desperate, claiming kind of kiss, filled with 6 long months of pain and wanting. Isabella held on to him, weeping, burying her face in his rough coat, the high ground. They did not stay in Boston. The legal wrangling over the Whitney fortune took about a year. But with the testimony from the doctor up in the mountains and all the evidence of Cornelius's fraud, Isabella won. She took the money, millions of dollars, and she sold off every last stick and stone. They went back to the Colorado Territory. They did not rebuild the old cabin. Instead, they bought the whole entire valley. They built a ranch, a sprawling sanctuary made of timber and stone they called Cad's Rest. Silas never did get the full use of his shoulder back, and he walked with that limp until the day he died. But he never had to hunt for his supper again. They had 3 children. The oldest, a boy they named Elias, grew up to be a ranger. The people of Oakhaven stopped calling her the Gargoyle. When Mrs. Consincade rode into town in a fine carriage with that giant of a husband beside her, folks would tip their hats. It was not out of fear, but out of honest-to-goodness respect, because every last one of them knew the story. They knew that poor mountain man had not just bought himself an ugly bride. He had found a queen among the ashes, and together the 2 of them had built their own kingdom. And every single year, on October the 14th, Silas would set a small pouch of gold dust on the mantelpiece, kiss his wife's scarred cheek, and whisper, "Best bargain I ever made." What a story. From the shame of an auction block in a dusty mining town to the marble altars of Boston high society, the tale of Silas and Isabella is a powerful reminder that a person's real worth is never just skin deep. It is forged in the fires of hard times. Silas did not need a perfect woman. He needed a partner who understood what pain felt like, and Isabella did not need a knight in shining armor. She needed a wildcat who would tear the whole world apart just to keep her safe. Their scars did not define who they were. They were what bound them together. If you enjoyed this epic tale of romance, revenge, and redemption, please do me a real kindness. Go on and hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves a good Western drama, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on a story. Let me know down in the comments. Do you think Silas should have spared that uncle of hers? Thanks for watching, and I will see y'all in the next one. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.